Today we are talking about ROJAVA with Daniel Norman. Daniel, can you please tell the audience about yourself?
Hi, everyone. Joel, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. Me and Joel met some years back. We were involved together in some pro-worker cooperative activism in Rhode Island. I'm an anarchist, pro-democracy advocate, definitely a leftist, and a big supporter and ally of ROJAVA and for a democratic society within ROJAVA, which is what Joel's very nicely asked me to come on this podcast to discuss. I have not been there on the ground myself, so I can't give a on the ground perspective. What I can speak to is the broad picture of what is happening with the revolution in ROJAVA and why I believe it is so important to the international left to understand and support the movement over there. I have done quite a bit to educate myself on the topic as far as my credentials to speak on this are concerned. I've spoken with and had the pleasure of meeting many people, from civilians to activists to even some politicians from ROJAVA. I actually once got the opportunity to meet and briefly talk with Ilham Ahmed, who was one of the co-presidents of ROJAVA's federal council. So I was so lucky to be able to have that happen and to get to ask her some questions about where she saw ROJAVA's revolution fitting into the broader struggle for freedom and democracy around the world.
Yes, well, I got some basic questions. Where is ROJAVA and what's the basic demographics of the area?
The Kurds are a ethnic, linguistic, cultural group, not exactly a religious group. There's many different religions present in Kurdistan, the historic homeland of the Kurdish people, and they are the victims of colonialism. Their historical, cultural, ethnic region of the world was subdivided by the great colonial powers after World War I, when they were carving up the Middle East as part of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And ROJAVA is split and dismembered today between Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. And you can see ROJAVA superimposed right over the region where those four countries meet. It's a diverse region, and the Kurdish people are by no means a monolith. There are many subcultures within this broad family of the Kurdish people. There are other non-Kurdish or semi-Kurdish, it gets all very complicated, groups that also live within that region, groups like the Yazidis, the Assyrians, there's overlap with Armenians. So Kurdistan is a cultural region of the world with a really deep and complicated history that unfortunately today is victimized by nation states, by borders, by the oppression of marginalized groups and minorities. And ultimately, this was all the handiwork of the European colonialists who carved up this region of the world in this way. So ROJAVA specifically is the part of Greater Kurdistan that falls within the borders of modern-day Syria. And the word ROJAVA basically translates to sunset. It is the westernmost part of Greater Kurdistan, the four quadrants of it being ROJAVA in Syria, the western part, Rojalet in Iran, the eastern part, and then Basra and Bakr, the northern and southern quadrants of it in Turkey and Iraq, respectively. The common experience of all the people who live within Kurdistan is unfortunately one of oppression, one of marginalization. In every single country they live in, they face violence and discrimination and political disenfranchisement and attempts to erase and destroy their local culture. And there is a unified desire of all the people in this part of the world who span this large region, we're talking tens of millions of people, to free themselves from the oppressive governments that they currently live under and are oppressed by, and to perhaps someday unite all these different regions. Rojava is the part of Kurdistan within Syria. Rojalet is the part of Kurdistan within Iran. Basra and Bakr are the parts of Kurdistan within Turkey and Iraq, respectively. There is a hope that all of these regions could someday come together and unite into a large Kurdish nation. But while that goal remains definitely far off into the future, In the present day, the political movements and parties that represent the interests of the Kurds in each of these regions have gone down very divergent tracks in their own struggles for freedom and independence. So the regional government of Iraqi Kurdistan is very politically different than the regional administration of Rojava, which is what we're going to be talking about, which is Syrian Kurdistan.
What is the history of the most recent conflicts in Rojava? Is it from the Syrian war, or does it predate the Syrian war?
So, to somewhat understand what's happened in Rojava, we need to first go north to Basra, the Kurdish part of Turkey, the most northern part of Kurdistan, the most southern part of Turkey. There, the Kurdish struggle for independence and freedom initially went down a Marxist leftist path. The major organization fighting against the Turkish government for the independence of the Kurdish region was called the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, run by this man named Abdullah Öcalan. And initially, it was a very traditionally Marxist insurgent guerrilla movement, definitely inspired and styling itself off of people like Che Guevara. And then what happened was Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of this organization, was captured by the Turkish authorities and has been living ever since then on an island prison where they placed him. Where he's been living till this day in isolation. While on that island, he developed a pen pal relationship, correspondence with a man named Murray Bookchin, who was an American-based libertarian socialist, anarchist thinker, a leftist of the very anti-authoritarian tradition, someone who rubbed elbows in progressive circles with people like Noam Chomsky and Bernie Sanders. And together, Murray Bookchin, this American leftist thinker, and Abdullah Öcalan, the isolated and imprisoned leader in name, but no longer leader in practice of the PKK, the Kurdish Workers' Party, decided to really take a critical eye towards the failings of older school 20th century Marxist type insurgent movements and to try to advance the theory of the struggle for freedom. And what they came up with is an ideology that they call democratic confederalism. And democratic confederalism has a couple of very interesting innovations in it, in how it tries to organize people. So instead of focusing on a purely guerrilla insurgent strategy, where the guerrillas separate themselves from communities and are focused on conflict with the state, hoping to topple or capture the government and become the new government, the focus of democratic confederalism is to embed revolutionaries within communities and to build community networks and councils and communes and cooperatives within the existing society that are parallel to the existing government and challenge the authority of the government by organizing people from below rather than directly always fighting with the existing government. This idea sometimes also goes under the name of dual power. And it's by no means unique to democratic confederalism, but democratic confederalism has really taken this idea of a revolution through the construction of dual power institutions and run with it. So this ideology of democratic confederalism made its way down into Syrian Kurdistan, Rojava. And also there were veteran fighters of the PKK from Turkey who did come down and linked up with organically organizing activists and revolutionaries within Rojava and gave them more experience when it came to combat and fighting. And when the Syrian civil war broke out, which started as a large coalition of anti-Assad forces. Assad is the dictator of Syria. He inherited the position of dictator from his father. He runs a terrible fascistic authoritarian state with a horrible human rights record. And then the Arab Spring came along and there were all these pro-democracy protests going on throughout the Middle East, and they came to Syria as well. And Assad brutally and violently cracked down on them, and that set off the Syrian civil war. And the first phase of the Syrian civil war was defined by Assad fighting against this very broad coalition of anti-Assad forces called the Free Syrian Army, which included leftist and pro-democratic factions, but it also included Islamic jihadist, reactionary conservative factions as well. And eventually ISIS would hit the scene and they would define a new chapter of the Syrian civil war. But where this matters to Rojava is that the Syrian civil war gave an opportunity for these underground networks of radicals and revolutionaries within Rojava, which is the northernmost part of Syria, to come out of the woodwork. And Assad basically withdrew all of his forces from Rojava to fight on other fronts within Syria, within the Syrian civil war. So Rojava emerged as a self-organizing, autonomous territory within Syria, declaring that it was really going to chart its own destiny away from the Assad government. But its goal was not explicitly to fight and to overthrow Assad like other revolutionaries within Syria, whose main goal was to topple Assad's government in Damascus. Rojava instead, following the strategy of community organizing and dual power, focused on replacing the old authoritarian local governments that, answered directly to Assad with their own democratic community councils, and organizing their revolutionary movement around the building of these autonomous democratic councils that were willing to live parallel with Assad's government in Damascus to whatever extent he was willing to live parallel with them. And their main concern for most of the Syrian civil war was surviving against ISIS attacks. And then their main concern after ISIS was defeated was surviving against the Turkish invasion into Syria. Because of the links between many of the revolutionaries in Rojava and the PKK in Turkey, the Turkish government run by Erdogan, who's a fascist autocrat, was very concerned about trying to annihilate and destroy Rojava's revolution before it spread back up into Turkey and threatened the power of Erdogan's government.
Right, that's good. And that gives us a chance to talk about the Kurds living in Turkey and what their situation's like. How is it for them living there?
Not good. They have been very oppressed throughout the history of the modern Turkish nation state. Turkey, under its current system of government, is a highly nationalistic country that really is very aggressively trying to stamp out all regional linguistic and cultural differences of its many, many ethnic minorities. I mean, the modern Turkish nation state was founded, briefly after the violence of the Armenian genocide, not to go too far into all those complexities. But even though the modern Turkish government, led by Kemal Ataturk, claimed that he had no involvement and he didn't have any direct involvement in the Armenian genocide, he still, in other ways, continued this process of a violent conformity over Turkish society. We are all Turkish now. We all must speak the Turkish language, and really just a complete denial of the independent existence of these other cultural and linguistic and ethnic groups within Turkey. And in the modern day, the Kurds within Turkey, continue to face that oppression. Their elected leaders go to jail for no reason. Their cultural figures go to jail for no reason. Simply speaking the Kurdish language in public in a city in Turkey gets you sent to jail for an indefinite period of time. There were many liberal and progressive Kurdish politicians elected not that long ago to Turkey's parliament. And then Erdogan, the autocratic fascist president, as he accrued his own power, just mass arrested all of them and sent them to jail. And there's substantial evidence of rigging of elections and throwing out of ballots to suppress the political influence of the Kurds within Turkey. And local governors, and mayors of Kurdish majority towns and cities within Turkey get snatched up by the authorities and sent to prison indefinitely all the time, and replaced basically just by mobster thugs who are loyal to Erdogan's government. So it's a tremendously oppressive environment. And it is miraculous to the extent to which, the Kurds within Turkey continue to try to engage in the political process and form political parties and send their representatives to government, they haven't stopped. And Erdogan is not all powerful. There has been pushback against him, but it's a very bleak situation within Turkey currently. And the Turkish forces are ruthlessly, murderously hunting down members of the PKK, the insurgent guerrilla forces of the Kurdish Workers' Party. And very often their reasoning behind arresting any Kurdish professor, Kurdish cultural figure, Kurdish politician is trumped up claims that they've been assisting the PKK, which is designated a terrorist group within Turkey due to its many decades of insurgency. But the Kurdish struggle continues within Turkey. It definitely, if freedom will come to the Kurds in Turkey, it will come through a very long arc of history. This is currently a very dark moment of time for them. And then right across the southern border of Turkey is ROJAVA, this example of a Kurdish region of a neighboring nation successfully becoming autonomous and being able to govern its own affairs in a democratic way. And that example is threatening to Turkey's government, and it's also threatening to Syria's government. It's threatening to all the authoritarian national governments of the region, because it shows the possibility that multicultural, decentralized democracy is possible.
How far is Turkey in Syria now fighting in Rojava?
Turkey's invasions into Rojava happened in two main waves, both under the Trump administration. When Rojava was forming, it started in city centers. The Assad forces, the Syrian Arab army, the army of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria, just pulled out and evacuated many of the Kurdish majority cities and towns, essentially leaving them to be slaughtered by ISIS as ISIS was coming. And a little bit of background about what the Kurds have faced within Syria. It's a similar situation. Oppression, erasure of, the local language and culture, forced assimilation, police open firing on student protests within Kurdish majority cities, terrible environmental destruction. Assad's forces had cut down a lot of the local just ecology of the trees that used to grow in that area for completely unsustainable wheat production that degraded the soil. I mean, Assad dehumanized and abused everyone living in Syria, and the Kurds in the north in Rojava got it very badly, as the Kurds do in all the countries that the Kurds find themselves living in. But back to the main story here. So Assad's forces withdraw from the Kurdish towns and cities, just leaving them to be slaughtered by ISIS because Assad needs those forces elsewhere. And the networks of underground activists and revolutionaries spring into force, and they very quickly take over those cities and establish democratic urban councils and cooperatives and all sorts of overlapping institutions to run the political and economic affairs and the military affairs, as their first task was to brace for the ISIS onslaught. And truly miraculously, they survived the ISIS onslaught and defeated ISIS and pushed back. And as they pushed back against ISIS, they moved out from the cities and towns and took over the countryside, incorporated the countryside and the smaller villages into their emerging democratic project, and territorially unified large swaths of northern Syria, Rojava, as they call it. But there was one city, one Kurdish majority city, that remained physically, geographically isolated from the rest of Rojava, and that was called the city of Afrin. And Turkey saw that city as vulnerable. So I believe it was back in 2018, Turkey launched an invasion and captured the city. There was a massive exodus of people from the city. It was a small, or not so small, ethnic cleansing event, and a huge part of the population of the city of Afrin fled to the main larger territory of Rojava, where they've stayed till today. And, the world was very silent on this and did not do much to stop it and basically just let Turkey have that one. Okay, now fast forward about a year or so after that, Turkey wants to have another invasion, another incursion into Rojava, and they start building up, and this time the main bulk largest territory of Rojava, not some sort of isolated island that's sectioned off from the rest of it. They want to invade the main territory. And they build up forces at the border. And the United States had been helping Rojava fight against ISIS. There were US bases all over Rojava to assist them in the fight against ISIS. And Turkey had been threatening for a long time, saying, we're coming in. And the US military had always just said, no, you're not. And then Erdogan called Trump on the phone. And after a half-hour conversation, Trump relented and just said, okay, Erdogan's coming in. It was a disaster. It was a horrible humanitarian disaster. Hundreds to thousands of people were killed. At the peak, I believe the estimated numbers was that there was anywhere from 100 to 300,000 refugees displaced by the fighting. Not to mention the fact that US soldiers on the ground were caught completely off guard, and they were embedded, sharing camps with local militia fighters within Rojava, and they were being fired upon by the Turkish army. This is truly an incredible moment in the history of the failing US empire. I mean, let's not forget Turkey is a NATO nation. It's not just any NATO nation. It is the second largest army in NATO. And here it was firing on allies of US forces. US forces themselves, there's no evidence a US soldier got killed, but US forces themselves came under fire, as well as French forces that had also been there to help the Kurds in Rojava. The US basically fled in a hurry from the region as Turkey came in, completely betraying the Kurds who we had been working with on the ground in the fight against ISIS. And the main thing that stopped the thrust of Turkey's invasion is Russia. Russia is the biggest backer of the government in Damascus of Bashar al-Assad, and they came in very quickly and swept up and took the abandoned US military bases and drew the line and stopped the Turkish advance from going any further. Now, it wasn't just Russia. It's not like the Kurds were completely helpless. Turkey went in and took the area that they knew would be the easiest area to take first, and they never got beyond that. They never pushed into where it would have become a really grueling, protracted fight. They took the lowest hanging fruit. They took a chunk out of Rojava, but the bulk of Rojava lived for another day, still with its territorial integrity intact, other than this one chunk that was taken out of it. Turkey had been hoping to basically split Rojava down the middle, segment the territory into disconnected pieces that could then be picked off one at a time, and it did not accomplish that. But it's a very precarious situation because Rojava now is reliant on Russia, unfortunately, as its security backer, whereas it had previously been reliant on the United States.
Wow, what a shift. I want to go back and talk about Öcalan and the Buchkin relationship.
There's a number of very interesting books that have been written on the topic. In fact, Murray Bookchin's daughter wrote a really great book on how Bookchin met with Abdullah Öcalan, how they analyzed and, found areas where they felt that old school leftist, Marxist, revolutionary movements had failed, how they came up with this what they called a new concept of democratic confederalism, though it takes a lot from a lot of existing currents within the leftist tradition, and how that has been implemented within Rojava. I believe the book is just called Rojava. Some of the things that I think are really important to learn about what has been implemented in Rojava, or at the very least, again, I'm not on the ground there, so I can't speak to all the little microscopic failings and hypocrisies that I'm sure exist throughout any human institution. But to look at the big picture of what they are trying to build here, they're trying to build a overlapping decentralized network of democratic councils. So Rojava's territory is administratively subdivided into what they call cantons, borrowing from the Swiss model. Switzerland is divided into what they call cantons, and a canton is a semi-self-governing, basically city-state, a city and the surrounding area. So each canton within Rojava is centered on one of their major cities, and then includes some of the rural and suburban area around it. So each canton has its own local council, and then there is a federal council that presides over all of them. And within the cantons, there's further subdivision into, local neighborhood and village administrations, sometimes called communes. That's the political dimension of things. And when you go really far down to the local level, there is an emphasis on direct democracy of community meetings. A lot gets handled through round circle meetings of the neighborhood or of the community. And in parallel to this highly decentralized democratic political system, there's also the economic system. The economic system is largely based on worker-owned cooperatives, and this is what got me excited about Rojava in the first place. So most of the economy of Rojava is comprised of worker-owned, democratically operated businesses that they then themselves form into economic federations. So just as many neighborhood and village political councils will send representatives up to the canton level council, which then sends representatives up to the federal level council, basically their parliament or legislature. You've got a parallel situation happening with the local level worker cooperatives being part of larger federations of cooperatives. Now, this is not the first, project around the world that's had the idea of direct democracy at the local level and then a set of levels of representative democracy. What I think they're doing that is unique is the realization that you don't just want to have one structure where everything funnels up to a single centralized authority at the top, but to have many different overlapping structures in a complicated network. So you've got the political structure, you've got the economic structure, and in both of these structures, you have lots of councils that have implemented rules of basically saying that there needs to be equal representation of all the different linguistic groups within the region. So you've got councils that will say 1/3 of our members are Kurds and 1/3 are Assyrian and 1/3 are Yazidi or Arabs, depending on what the particular ethnic composition of the region is. There's rules that mandate equal representation of men and women. So at the highest level, at the federal level within Rojava, there is a co-presidency with a male and a female president. I got to meet and briefly speak with Ilham Ahmed, who was at the time the female co-president of Rojava. And in addition to the sort of split between these different ethnic groups and between genders, that there's also parallel to all of this dedicated communes, villages, trade federations, just of women or just of a particular smaller marginalized ethnic minority. They really have taken the strategy of redundant organizations such that everyone is hopefully represented multiple times over in multiple ways. They've really taken the idea of checks and balances to quite an extreme. At the very least, that is the goal that they are aspiring to. A structure that is not just kind of bottom up in the emphasis of democracy, but horizontally overlapping, in that you could be represented by someone on your local village council and also be represented by someone through your job at one of the worker cooperatives who you've sent up to the level of the worker cooperative trade federation level. There are multiple different parallel existing democratic institutions within this society, and it's very complicated to track all of them and understand how they all fit together. And it probably sounds like a super complicated mess. This is the exact opposite of revolutionary centralism. So much of revolutionary theory has been about the need to basically subordinate all the revolutionary authority, all the revolutionary forces to a single centralized authority that could then act very effectively and quickly, or at least that was the idea. And ROJAVA has really tried to go in the opposite direction of having redundancy and an extreme number of checks and balances and incredible amounts of local power and local decision making. And I think the natural question arises, well, how does all of this end up getting you effective governance? And I think the answer there is that the people living within ROJAVA have a united purpose. The reason why what could be seen as an overly complicated, overly redundant set of democratic structures is able to work effectively is that throughout it all of the, or not all of the people, but enough of the people who live within this region are committed to this project and to making it work and to, when there's a problem in a village, the whole village gathers and they try to figure it out themselves before sending their problem up to the authorities on a higher level if they can't resolve it. The higher level federal structures are not burdened by having to micromanage every little thing because people have embraced their civic democratic participatory responsibility and they try to settle things and work things out on the local level as much as possible. And that definitely takes a lot of responsibility off of the higher levels. And then when the higher levels come down with important big scale decisions like large scale military tactics, they have to get all of the militias of all of these villages and all of these cities. And I didn't even really get into that whole structure, but the military structure parallels to some extent the complexities of the political and the economic structure as well, with federal level militias and city level militias and town level militias and militias that exist just to represent one particularly oppressed, marginalized group that needed guns of their own, and militias just for women to overcome patriarchal oppression. There's all of these different armed groups existing simultaneously with their own jurisdictions and degrees of semi-autonomous authority within ROJAVA, and they all have to ultimately come together for the big fights, for the fight against the Turkish invasion, for the fight against the ISIS invasion. And it is mass parallelism put into practice. Instead of a single commander who sends out a plan of action that then gets robotically followed by everyone on the lower chains, there is a setting of broad strategy and agendas coming from the federal level councils, but they are reliant on people to enthusiastically take matters into their own hands for all of these different groups to come together every time to accomplish the big tasks that they need to. And that really is only made possible by the fact that the people there, at least in a large enough extent, believe in this project and believe in this system and believe that if they all participate in it, then it will work. It is a system that requires everyone's active participation to function.
Wow, that sounds very inspiring. What does the future of ROJAVA look like?
That is a very difficult question to answer. They are in an unfortunate limbo at the moment. They, thankfully, for the time being, ISIS seems to be defeated, but they are squeezed in on every side. I mean, their biggest threat at the moment is Turkey, still, to the north. But then you've got Assad's government to the south. And now that Assad has defeated the other revolutionaries, the Free Syrian Army, as it was called, that was fighting to depose Assad, ROJAVA is the last remaining competitor to Assad within Syria. It's down to the two of them. They are the two surviving factions of the Syrian civil war, and Assad is backed by Russia And now, when Rojava was under the protection of the United States, Russia would not let Assad move in to Rojava's territory. But then when Trump abandoned them, really backstabbed them, they had to fall under the umbrella of Russia's protection against Turkey. And there was quite a lot of fear in that moment that that would be the end of their autonomy. That now that they were, to some extent, at least when it came to keeping Turkey at bay, having to answer to Russia, that Putin would just place them right back under the control of Assad. That has not happened, though. And the reason it has not happened is twofold. One, Putin does not like Assad. Assad has been a terrible partner for Putin. Assad has cost Putin so much money and just been awful in the relationship. I mean, Putin is deeply in bed with Assad. He's overly committed to Assad. It's sunk cost fallacy at this point. But I think that when people see proxy fights as being driven by the outside powers, that's sometimes a mistake. Sometimes it's the lesser faction on the ground who is leading the way. I mean, Assad would just do things without Putin's permission that Putin did not want Assad to do, and Assad would just go ahead and cause problems and then turn back to Putin to bail him out. And because Putin had already invested so much in Assad, he would come back and bail out Assad every time. So Putin has never been happy with Assad. And now that Putin has, to a large extent, managed to remove US influence from Rojava, that was Putin's big goal. And Putin doesn't see any need to hand Rojava back over to Assad. Putin seems to be fairly happy to control the board of Syria by having both Assad and Rojava dependent separately on Putin to guarantee their security against Turkey, but not have Rojava be placed back under the control of Assad. So that's part of it. And of course, what's happening today in Ukraine and what's happening with Putin now is very possibly going to shake up this equilibrium. And who knows what's about to happen next if Putin's grasp on power in Russia or simply his sanity is deteriorating, possibly, under the current situation in Ukraine. So that's a huge question mark that comes next. Good or bad, it's hard to tell, but this current equilibrium that's been in place for the last couple of years of Putin separately being a begrudging protector of Rojava and Assad may be coming to an end, but we'll have to see. The other thing is that Assad has tried to re-implement some control within Rojava, and it has failed. And it really shows the success of Rojava's dual power strategy. You know, Assad said he wanted to send some forces back into Rojava. And in fact, he never completely gave up all of his police stations and bases within the territory of Rojava. There has always been these little islands, you know, little militarized compounds of Assad soldiers within Rojava. And Assad has tried to flex that power and tried to send some of his people back in, but they can't govern. The autonomous local democratic councils that Rojava has set up have proven to be robust enough as this parallel governing structure that even if Assad claims on paper to still be the government over this territory, he is completely ineffective. The locals, through their democratic councils, run everything. Assad has even set up within Rojava recruitment offices, you know, to create new police forces within Rojava to govern the territory under his control to compete with Rojava's own militias. And what happens is everyone from Rojava's militias goes and enlists within those police forces and takes them over from the inside. Rojava has really demonstrated in such a radical way the success of building dual power institutions so deeply embedded into communities that they can just sort of flexibly come to inhabit whatever the formal structures of government are. Any attempt of a governing authority from up high to get control of the situation is thwarted by the resiliency of the people who live there. So that's been very impressive, and that's been very inspiring to see. So they are holding their own, but it's a very precarious equilibrium where they are surrounded by wolves on all sides. And the last thing is that to their west is Iraqi Kurdistan, something I haven't really been able to chat about too much. Iraqi Kurdistan is in many ways in a similar situation as Rojava. Iraqi Kurdistan, Bakr, is the northern part of Iraq and the southern part of Kurdistan, and it has itself for a long time struggled for autonomy against the Iraqi central government in Baghdad. Under Saddam Hussein during the Gulf War, that conflict gave an opportunity for the Iraqi Kurds to try to assert themselves and gain some local autonomy. And both times when Saddam ultimately proved that he was going to remain in power, he swung right around and violently punished the Kurds for even daring, to revolt against him and try to achieve their own freedom, culminating in a genocidal poison gas attack against Kurdish cities within Iraqi Kurdistan, which was just absolutely horrible. And another example of the United States saying it would back up the Kurds and then abandoning them when they most needed U.S. support. So the Iraqi Kurds have suffered greatly as well, and the U.S. invasion of Iraq gave them some opportunity to gain a bit of that local independence that they had been struggling for, and the fight against ISIS also gave them more opportunity to assert their local independence, much like in Rojava. Iraqi Kurdistan is a democracy within a much more classic Western European style of democracy, not a radical left-wing anarchist inspired democracy the way Rojava has. Iraqi Kurdistan is at best, corrupt, conservative, representative democracy. Now, it is leagues above the Iraqi central government in terms of democratic and progressive values, but its aspirations are maybe to be like red state America. Republicans really liked Iraqi Kurdistan. It is completely dominated and run by this clan, the Barzani family. I might be mispronouncing that name. So, it's a representative democracy, but it's a kleptocratic, corrupt, capitalistic, conservative representative democracy. It looks progressive compared to what else is in the region, but it's not intrinsically anything radical from a left-wing perspective the way Rojava is. And early in Rojava's revolution, the border between them and Iraqi Kurdistan was open. And this was how supplies and volunteers were getting into Rojava, because Iraqi Kurdistan has an airport. And you could fly into Iraqi Kurdistan and then get in a car and drive into Rojava. It was that simple. And that is no longer the case. That has also added to Rojava's isolation. Iraqi Kurdistan was hoping to basically colonize and take over Rojava in the early days, to just place Rojava almost as like a vassal state under the control of the Iraqi Kurdish government. Iraqi Kurdistan is very Kurdish nationalistic. Their government sees themselves as the sort of legitimate representative, not just of the Kurds in Iraq, but basically all Kurds. So they saw it as their right, their entitlement to try to take over Rojava. And Rojava rejected them. And there was violence. There was a small amount of skirmishing that ensued between Rojava's local forces and some of the forces from Iraqi Kurdistan that came over. So that's just another layer to which Rojava had to fight for its independence, not just its independence from Syria and from Turkey, but also its independence from an already existing, more established, more powerful at the time, parallel Kurdish government within Iraq. And after that skirmishing, the Iraqi-Kurdish border was closed to them, and those tensions have thawed out. Rojava is actually on much better terms today, has resolved this kind of festering, sore, and kind of unfortunate issue of its bad relations with Iraqi Kurdistan. But Iraqi Kurdistan lost control of the border territory to Rojava. As ISIS was being rolled back and defeated, the Iraqi government, the central government in Baghdad, and not even actually the formal central government in Baghdad, but the Iranian-backed paramilitary groups that are really in charge of Iraq today, that basically took over Iraq. If you remember, there was this Iranian general Soleimani who was in Iraq, and then Trump drone striked him and caused a whole issue of we nearly went to war with Iran. And that was just another example of Trump just absolutely messing up the entire region. Every decision he made was wrong on both a humanitarian level and a strategic level. He could not have messed everything up worse. But why was there an Iranian general in Iraq? Because Iran came in and basically bailed out the Iraqi central government in its fight against ISIS, and then installed their own forces as a shadow government, they're called the PMU, and they're the people really in control of Iraq today, and they're just awful. Anyway, with ISIS defeated, the Iraqi central government, but really the PMU, who's actually in control of things, decided that it was going to also grab a bunch of territory from Iraqi Kurdistan. And the Iraqi Kurdish defense of their territory failed quite pathetically, unfortunately. It spoke to the corruption and the dysfunction of the command structure of Iraqi Kurdistan. They didn't lose all their territory, but they had expanded. As they were fighting ISIS, they had taken over more territory, and then the PMU took a lot of that territory back. So now Rojava is physically disconnected from Iraqi Kurdistan because Iraqi Kurdistan lost that territory to the PMU. So Rojava is just isolated by hostile forces on all sides. And this gets me to what I think is one of the last points here that's really important to talk about in how to interpret things from an outside perspective and from a left-wing perspective. Rojava has at times worked with the United States. They have at times worked with Russia. They are surrounded by wolves and bears and all these powerful factions, and they have survived, through their own revolutionary forces, their fighting spirit, their camaraderie, and the institutions they've built for their people. But they've also survived, critically, by playing the big powers off of each other, by going back and forth between the United States and Russia. And there was a very lazy criticism of Rojava leveled by some people nominally on the left, essentially saying that they shouldn't count as a leftist project that should be supported while they were working with the United States. Well, first of all, I think that's just completely unreasonable. It's completely unreasonable to say that a group of people should just lie down and die rather than receiving help from the outside just because of where that help should come from. Whoever they receive help from in desperation, that, in my mind, does not invalidate the value of the revolutionary project of the democratic institutions they have built there domestically within their territory. But also, they were never a puppet of the United States, and they were never a puppet of Russia. In fact, they have demonstrated how much agency a small player can have. I mean, they are small, and they do not have fighter jets. They barely have enough bulletproof vests to go around for their militia forces. They have civilian militias with hand-me-down AKs and some armored vehicles. They barely even have any tanks, and they've made really effective use of what they have. They are if you look at it on paper in terms of armament, a weak player on the global map. But they are strong, and they are resilient, and they are not just effective in their fighting at ground level, their sniping, their trench warfare, their guerrilla fighting. They have been very diplomatically effective at playing the larger superpowers off of each other in order to cling on to survival. And it's very precarious, and they have been betrayed. And they could be betrayed again. They are dancing on a knife's edge here, but the way in which they have managed to go back and forth in their diplomatic relations between the US and Russia, I think, is one of their innovations. It is an innovation to revolutionary planning. A lot of revolutionary thinking has either said that you essentially have to pick one global faction and stick with it. And in the Cold War, a lot of leftists would have said that faction has to be the USSR. You could never accept support from the United States. Or the thinking was, revolutionary projects are never going to be able to strike any short-term deals with outside powers. Or if they ever do strike a short-term deal with an outside power, that's just them selling their soul, and that will be the death of their revolutionary project immediately. And I think ROJAVA has, amongst other things, very definitively proven that narrative to be false. Small factions, weak factions on paper in terms of their arms and their weapons and their machinery, can in fact hold their own in negotiations with multiple great powers around the world without compromising their values or the revolutionary institutions that they are trying to build. And I think that is almost beyond anything else one of the most important things that ROJAVA has demonstrated, that we in leftist activist networks around the world looking in on this from afar need to try to understand and incorporate into our own thinking about how to build dual power institutions and make real revolutionary gains, from an underdog position in a world still inhabited by these great nationalistic, capitalistic, authoritarian superpowers.
Well, thank you very much, Daniel. Is there any books or resources that you would recommend? We can put links down below, but do you have any books you recommend?
One book, it's called Revolution in ROJAVA. This was the one that I referenced earlier. This was the one written by Murray Bookchin's daughter. And that definitely is a great comprehensive overview of it. I would start there. That's the one that comes to mind most immediately. A lot of how I've educated myself on the topic has been watching firsthand media from ROJAVA, both their own local media and all the foreign correspondents that have gone over there. David Graeber, rest in peace, great American anarchist theorist and thinker who sadly died just a year ago. He went over to ROJAVA. He wrote about it extensively. So his writings on the topic, I think, are really good. There are ROJAVA and more generally Kurdish solidarity groups here in the United States. I've gone to many of their events. That's how I've met many people involved in the movement who have been over there and gotten to learn a lot. And actually, on that point, I'd like to end things on just one quick anecdote. So I went to a talk that was being given by Ilham Ahmed. This is how I got to meet her. She had come to the United States on a diplomatic voyage, and she went to Congress and she spoke with our representatives here. But I got to see her when she came to speak just to a local Kurdish cultural society in Connecticut, at this random hotel conference room in Connecticut. That's where I got to see her. And it was very fascinating because she openly at the time was talking about how she was here to try to secure more security guarantees from the US government, but that they were also working on a back channel with Russia in case that failed. And thank God they did. They really conscientiously have been pursuing every opportunity they have to buy time and survive. There was a Q&A afterwards, and I asked her a very broad question, which was, what do you believe it would take to spread ROJAVA's democratic system, their worker cooperative system, their commune council system, all these innovative developments they've made in bottoms up democratic organizing? What would it take to spread that system around the world? Because that is what I am ultimately, for me, the big question. My activism here in the United States concerns the promoting of worker cooperatives, and worker cooperatives are so central to ROJAVA's economic system. And I want to know what she would have to say about that, of what would it take to spread their system around the world. And she looked at me like that was kind of a dumb question. And she goes, well, download a PDF of our social contract and share it with your friends. And I kind of love that. Thinking back on that memory, there was a real just matter-of-factness that at the end of the day, it's time to put aside kind of all this highfalutin theory about when is the revolution coming, when have the contradictions of capitalism finally reached their breaking point, how is it going to happen? And her answer to me, very short and succinct right there, with a real, I've got no time for nonsense, no time for BS type of attitude, was just, The revolution will happen when people take examples of what has already worked and they try to spread it and they try to innovate on it. There's no one magic solution. What's the point of that? It is on us everywhere we live, in whatever community we are a part of, to struggle for democracy, to learn from other projects that have succeeded elsewhere and try to incorporate what we can from them to our situation, and to act in spontaneous solidarity to try to support those other revolutionary projects around the world. So, beyond any particular book or bit of news media, I would say for people who really are interested in this topic, to see if there is a Kurdish solidarity society somewhere where you live, and go talk to people there about what they know and what their experiences have been, and try to learn firsthand and form connections and friendships with, as best you can, with the people over there, because it is through that decentralized construction of connections and networks that we can build dual power institutions everywhere around the world in solidarity and support of each other. So that's where I'd like to end things on.
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your time
Thank you
and
for
for
having
sharing
me.
your knowledge. And we will hear back from you again soon. Thank you.
I'd love to be on again. It was so great. Thank you, Joel.